Welcome to the sixth meeting on Badiou's philosophy, a primer for the fresh. My name is Norman Mataras. We're moving our way slowly but steadily and in depth through Alain Badiou's philosophy. I've taken made the decision to go through Manifesto for Philosophy as a general primer for the fresh, precisely not wanting to assume too much knowledge beforehand of his philosophy and wanted to make things rather clearer about its architecture, which perhaps are not that evident, not that easily reachable within either a course context or even reading the secondary material on his work. I highly recommend one start with a very objective, to the letter type of introduction, which is precisely what I'm trying to do in these classes. So last time we were discussing the question of sutures and why this is problematic to both philosophy's operation as well as to its persistence, and how Badiou touched upon the suture as one of the main reasons for which the impression that philosophy may have entered into its terminal phase became so prevalent in the 1970s and 1980s. Uh, Certainly, Heidegger was helpful in that regard, and there is a Nietzschean factor involved in this, and everything comes together, everything converges on this rather misunderstood chapter 7 of Manifesto for Philosophy, which is called The Age of the Poets. And this is the chapter I would like to discuss in detail with you today, sticking very close to Badiou's argument. But let me just set something up first. It becomes very clear that through the 19th century, and particularly the impact of German philosophy on the way philosophy is thought in general, internationally, we can identify a move within philosophical inquiry towards the aesthetic experience. And here, the aesthetic experience moving away from its original conception as a science that would deal with sensory and sensual and the lived experience through sensations dimension of human thought and how this dimension contributes to forming, shaping, and organizing human thought. Nietzsche, in the Genealogy of Morals, third dissertation, will actually consider art to be a more efficient way to think of the importance of truth than philosophy itself and science itself. Of course, Nietzsche is speaking from within the moral organization or, let's say, configuration in which the ideal of the ascetic has come to define the dualism that is now predominant in the production not only of religious knowledge and faith as it was in the early part of the moral period in which the slave mentality dominated, but it has also come to define the relationship between thought to technology and science. And philosophy can hardly remove itself from the ascetic ideal. Only art can, and that's because of its conviction that truth is only reachable through the false. So Nietzsche, of course, seeks revenge against a history which is basically encompasses the entirety of philosophical inquiry since Plato, when the slave mentality comes to prevail over the master's mentality, morally set and understood, in which the prime value, the prime ideal is beauty. You know? Nietzsche will attack Plato for his conviction that truth and beauty are on par as being the among the three supreme ideas, the other one being the good. Namely, because it seems that the price Plato has to pay for equalizing these three supreme ideas is that poetry, particularly epic poetry and tragedy, will have to be expelled. Well, first of all, censored and then expelled from any rationally constituted configuration of community, the politeia itself, insofar as epic poetry and tragedy have misrepresented the relationship between man and the gods or the demi gods as characteristic of the literature produced during Greek polytheism. So Nietzsche's mission, part of Nietzsche's mission, in order to promote a transvalorization of all values, is to uh, integrate art once again into the space of valorization and debunk philosophy's conviction that it is by capturing truth, by identifying truth, eventually by possessing truth, that one actually reaches the true. Nietzsche's argument was very persuasive for many decades and is foundational to contemporary French philosophy. But it also led and prompted Heidegger to see within the poetic word, what Badiou calls in French le dire poétique, the poetic word, the place where being itself shows itself in its oscillatory, almost quantic dimension of appearing and disappearing simultaneously as a type of event that philosophy has lost control over due to its delimitation within the principle of non-contradiction. Now, Badiou does not, for all his Platonism, aspire to a return to a time when philosophy, particularly reaching its legitimacy through the constitution of a guardian class, as in Plato's Politeia, would once again seek to legislate regarding the type of arts that would be proper to promote as occurring within the ideal and ethically grounded politeia. One cannot mix up these two factors, which is often the case. Badiou being a Platonist, as we shall go on to see later in the later in the later chapters of the book. Therefore, Badiou anti-poet. That is not at all the argument here. Badiou will argue that, in fact, philosophers, by suturing their art to that of poetry, transferred onto the poets a charge, a weight, a responsibility for which the poets are innocent. Nonetheless, he does point out through the presence of this more philosophical uh, relationship to poetic uh, to the poetic word that a certain number of poets, particularly representative of the period when philosophy was sutured to its poetic condition, express their desire to be free of the philosophical weight and responsibility that has been transferred onto their shoulders. The chapter, The Age of Poets, is the one in which Badiou demonstrates this argument, and I more than suggest we follow him as meticulously as he engages in explaining to us what his conviction is on this point. So Badiou tells us the age of the poets is completed. And of course, one of the first questions we're completely entitled to ask is, who are the poets? Well, just a minute. Well, now that you have seen them all, I'm touching actually the wrong arrow due to my whip. Sorry for it. We'll see whether I can actually edit that after. Badiou basically selects a group of 6 or 7 poets, mainly French and German, who express this anguish of being constrained to explore the dimensions of philosophical truth. Badiou's argument, once again, is that truth is found, let's say, in the space of lived experience. This is a phenomenological term, but I'm not using it in a phenomenologically specific term. We can speak about, the set theoretic universe if you like, but that's not necessary at this point because we are delving into the poetic condition, and once we delve into any of the conditions, any of the truth procedures, we are already in a materialized experience, which is not necessarily limited to human experience, but it is material nonetheless. So that's why I don't use the term natural experience. We're we're in material experience here in the context of the poet. Uh, the fact that it is not delimited as a world here, and I'm anticipating some of the doubts regarding the relationship between the logics of worlds being an event two and being an event one, because precisely Badiou seems to suggest that for that there's a lack, or the fact that world is not present in being an event one would constitute some type of lack or some type of incompletion of the ontological model. My perspective on that, and I believe it's coherent along with Badiou's thinking of the architecture of the system, is that being an event one deals with generic subjectivity. And what is generic subjectivity from an ontological angle? Well, it's the thought of the way subject procedures are built through truth, and insofar as they are built truth, truth, in fact, is their only object. Its only intrinsic object, if we try to generalize the notion of conditioned subjects by a general category of subject. And in any case, whenever Badiou speaks of the subject, he is speaking of this general category, which only makes sense as a derived, inferential object, occasionally a capital S in Badiou's prose, is precisely because it refers to the cardinality of a set in which we can identify four distinct subjects as being its members. But that's not even necessary to think in these terms right now. The set theoretic consequences will emerge as we see the distinctive processes, material processes occurring in each of the conditions because we've come to observe and attest to the fact that if philosophy appears to no longer exist or to be in such a dramatic decline, it's because it has been sutured to its different conditions. So we're facing a situation that is in considerable chaos and disorganization, if not disorientation, as he sometimes uses the term. You mathematicians expired, Mallarmé writes, and Badiou quotes him. Arthur Rimbaud is used from the following phrase, poetic phrase. Weak minded people begin to think about the first letter of the alphabet, would rush into madness. Badiou reads this literally, although not in relation to the Greco-Latin alphabet, but to the Judaic Aleph-Beth. For the first letter of the Aleph-Beth is through the agreement on terminology, the sign of the infinite set, the first infinite set, Aleph. Omega, of course, is the sign of the ordinal infinite set. So Aleph refers to the cardinality of an infinite set, and they rush into madness. Well, perhaps Georg Cantor did not rush into madness by thinking about the first letter of the alphabet, but he certainly seemed to be disturbed by the fact that first letter of the alphabet was no longer absolute. Lautréamont. Oh, rigorous mathematics, I have not forgotten you since your wise lessons, sweeter than honey, filtered into my heart like a refreshing wave. Without you, in my struggle against man, I would perhaps been defeated. Oh, rigorous mathematics. What is going on here? What is going on? What is Lautréamont, if we follow Badiou's argument, trying to tell philosophers regarding mathematics? Well, we have to recall, and Badiou has not made a very strong point of this question so far in Manifesto. That's why I also go back to the question, it is true that Logique des mondes, logics of worlds, is also accompanied by a manifesto, but the manifesto there is more of a manual explaining what is the content of the second volume of Being an Event. The manifesto here, and particularly reflected in the very wise decision made by the editors of this volume, to suggest that we include the definition, the the return of philosophy itself and the definition of philosophy as part of this volume. Because compared to either logics of worlds or the immanence of truth, being an event appears incomplete. And it's incomplete because the political condition is not present. We do have the presence of the poetic condition, but a poetic condition that is completely freed from any type of suture. Remember that Logics of Worlds examines the unsutured conditions in relation to philosophy as well as the sutured forms. Being an event does not examine any of sutured forms. That we find only in Manifesto. So Manifesto here is a supplement along with Can Politics Be Thought to being an event, without which being an event is somewhat incomplete. So Badiou has not stressed the argument that mathematics is ontology. And I open a parenthesis saying that it is true that in 2018, I was there. Badiou surprised his broader research team when proclaiming that, in fact, the thesis is not consistent and therefore he has to reorganize his definition and his model of ontology. Now, it is not that easy. we could want we could say after criticizing him for so long, we can also tell him it's not that easy just to redefine and claim that it's not mathematics. Of course, what Badiou means is mathematics as a whole is not ontology. What ontology is set theory, or set theory is ontology. So here, if one is in a struggle, and if mathematics is instrumental or useful in that struggle to win, what we are seeing here is that at least mathematics prevents philosophy, would prevent philosophy from being sutured. Now, as we know, through Hegel's articulation of the science of logic, there is a diminishing of the importance of mathematics and eventually a separation from mathematics that occurs within Hegelian philosophy and post Hegelian philosophy, even though a Marxian would probably object to generalizing or giving too much power to that separation. The separation really occurs with Heidegger, and it occurs for a very short period of time because even Husserl was a trained, educated, and trained mathematician. But Newton's binomial theory is as beautiful as the Venus de Milo. The fact is precious few care, as Fernando Pessoa, in one of his nominal poetic figures, will write. So we are bringing back the context indeed to a Platonism. And Rimbaud, once again, with some men I often talked out loud with some woman from one of their other lives. That's how I happened to love a pig. Here, Badiou argues, we find two key poetic and mathematical operations. We find the terminal self-dissolution by subtraction that is specific to the event, although it is played out in reverse form, as it were. The event, although we should not, harp on this too much or be too convinced by this, the event theoretically comes first. But this doesn't really make sense in terms of the argument because the event is not perceivable. Well, it can be named. But what is being named are its effects, as similar as they are to what we represent as possibly being an event. But what is the event in terms of a process, in terms of the condition of love? Is the event saying and hearing from the other that they love you? Or is it something that we see in the other's eyes or body movement? Or is it something prior to that that we only see in terms of its effects that we call body movement or gaze or glance or look or self-disillusion by subtraction? The other poetic operation is that object is extracted from appearance and is rendered to endless substitution. This means that the object is unstable. This even brings us back to the first thesis of Feuerbach by Marx, whereby he claims that the object, as seen by Ludwig Feuerbach's uh, post-idealist materialism, is in fact either reduced to the object status of science brought to its highest abstraction, or as something completely physical, denuded of any particular uh, cognition or thinking ability. And what Feuerbach misses due to his continual Christian devoutness is the fact that the object, in fact, conceals subjectivity. The object is a sensuous being made actual by subjectivity. So here, the appearance is rendered to endless substitution because we are not dealing with either reduction or, let's say, marginalization. I'm going to come back to the theses Badiou presents in this chapter and go through them briefly. But before that, here we reach the fundamental terminal point of the age of poets, which Badiou sees as most vividly expressed in the verse by Paul Celan, on inconsistencies to lean. Here, Badiou does not hesitate to see Celan as completing Heidegger and proceeding to desuture philosophy from the poetic word, neither through refutation, negation, sublation, or erasure, since all of these operations are rational operations developed by philosophy and not the poem. On inconsistencies to lean. We're not speaking about contradictions or paradoxes either, specifically, but where in Celan's reaching out and confrontation with Heidegger do we identify the space of inconsistencies? Well, if we follow Badiou's argument in this chapter, he presents us with a number of conceptual operators that's indeed required to follow if we want to understand what is going on here. The fundamental line followed by our poets, which enables them to subtract themselves from the effects of philosophical sutures, is the destitution of the category of object. Badiou has already made clear that philosophy, the task of philosophy, in fact, is to reorganize itself in terms of the three major categories, which are being, subject, and truth. What's fundamental to achieve is for philosophy to dislodge itself from the complex of subject and object. That's why being an event one is declared to produce an ontology of subject without an object. This is the very inverse to Heidegger's critique of subject. From the time of being and time, Heidegger argues that the subject, in fact, is objective or object based existence, insofar as intentionality, taken to its ultimate limits, captures the subject or captures consciousness in the material equipment of in der Weltsein, of being in the world. The task then is to break with that capturing, that enclosure of Dasein within a world that fools consciousness as to its real destiny, which is being there. The second operator present in these poets is the following. What gave potency to Heidegger's thinking was to have crossed the strictly philosophical critique of objectivity with its poetic destitution. As Badiou goes on to say, his stroke of genius, apart from the fact that it's merely just a mode of suturation, this time to the poetic condition, is to have grasped, particularly through his examination of Kant, that what separated fundamental ontology from the doctrine of cognition was the maintenance in the latter of the category of object, the guideline and absolute limit of the Kantian critique, and to have avoided, for all that, falling into subjectivism or into a radical philosophy of consciousness, a path ultimately followed by Husserl, and to have remained steadfast in the capital distinction between knowledge and truth, or between cognition and thought, a distinction that is the latent foundation of the poetic venture, and to have reached the point at which it is possible to hand philosophy over to poetry, as I was saying. So Heidegger's conceptualization has been very strong on this point. But Badiou argues that the age of the poets is completed. It is also necessary to desuture philosophy from its poetic condition now, which means that it's no longer required today that disobjectivation, and disorientation be stated in the poetic metaphor. Disorientation can be conceptualized, which is one of the characteristics of philosophical thought over, let's say, literary thought, is its capacity to retreat from the use of metaphors. Derrida's considerations here are secondary. I won't go into them. We're separating because Derrida can simply be seen or as partaking in this very suture, particularly given Derrida's refusal to think the subject beyond, let's say, the ends of man, which is, in my reading, just a reiteration of the theme of the end of humanism, first presented by Levi-Strauss or Althusser, or eventually Foucault. Uh, so the third operator here is also Heideggerian in nature. Uh, that Heidegger, in fact, doesn't so much identify uh, being, the truth of being in the poetic word, uh, as he constructs an antinomy of the mathem with the poem at the site of the poem, in such a way as to make it coincide with the opposition of knowledge and truth, or the subject object couple in being. So he reconducts the subject object complex to the position here of the poetic word as supposedly or allegedly allowing the uh, the philosopher to escape from its or his or her instrumentalized language, limited by the Aristotelian uh, binomial logic and by the recourse to binomials. The fourth operation, so Heidegger actually fails in creating the suture, which, from a philosophical angle, according to Badiou, is uh, highly uh, actual and, in fact, allows philosophy to terminate the process. So the fourth point is that the central operation from which we may receive and consider a poet from the age of poets is his method of disobjectification. So here we have a methodology at work, and this is what we were discussing previously regarding Rimbaud's method and Mallarmé's method. Badiou writes, the poem orders lack or disorders presentation. The subject is simultaneously terminated either by being absented, Mallarmé, or being actual pluralization, Pessoa, Rimbaud. Nothing is better than the inventory of these procedures to indicate the extent to which these poems are closely related, in fact, provisionally substituted to the construct of the space of thinking which defines philosophy. Okay? And the relationship and the proximity occurs not because of a series of proper names and absolutes that are evoked by the philosophical poets or the metaphysical poets, but by a series of operations whereby truth is an operator, is a concept that is most productively useful when used to examine the consequences of an event occurring within that space of thought. Now, whenever that occurs, one is involved in the process of constituting a subject. One enters a space of a subject information to which we are either an element or a part, but by no means a governor, leader, or master, much less author. So Paul Celan's work states at the terminal edge and from within poetry, the end of the age of poets. That's the last operator. So here we can see that Badiou performs what is basically an act of desuturing from a situation that is already present but has not been expressed in such a form. In fact, in Heidegger's wake or in Heidegger's flow, philosophers seem to be taken into the current of repeatedly suturing their field into that of the poetic word. This at a time when the Age of Poets is finished and a series of poets have made it clear why it had to finish, why the suture harmed not only philosophy, but also poetry itself. So, this is one of the characteristics of Badiou's thought, which, in fact, is one of its great virtues, is that philosophy has absolutely no business, in Badiou's view, of legislating how, what, and in which way the constitution of truth procedures in the conditions ought to occur. At best, what philosophy achieves is an extraction of the repeated regularities triggered every time a profoundly new creative process appears in one of these conditions. And one of the instruments that allows us to determine whether something like that is in process is when we encounter an event. And that's why chapter 8 will go on to discuss a series of events. I do not want to go into them because they are very specific. This is one of the characteristics of Badiou's philosophy that in order to test the more general model, in this case, it's the ontology, he will plunge into the different conditions and provide very detailed analysis of each condition in this task of examining whether the model is accurate or not. But we can nonetheless conclude here by skipping over the questions related to the condition of love, the condition of politics, and return to the question of the poetic word or the order of the poem. When Badiou writes that the event here, the most recent event, at least from the time that he is writing, is Paul Celan's work in and of itself, as well as through what it holds from the entire age of poets at its ultimate edge. Recall that Paul Celan was a lecturer at the École Normale Supérieure for many years, and dramatically in the end of the 1960s, he took his own life and his body was found in the Seine. So Badiou's generation was marked deeply by Celan's production and also by his proximity to their own work as researchers affiliated with the École Normale Supérieure. That's why Celan is so important here in Badiou's work as well as in Jacques Derrida's work. But continuing here to examine why Celan, in fact, is an event. Badiou writes that it is symptomatic that it is in reference to Celan's poems that ventures of thinking as diverse as Derrida's, Gadamer's, or Lacoulabat's pronounce the ineluctable suture of philosophy to its poetic condition. So here we have Celan coming in fact, to interrupt the suture. How does this occur? Well, the interruption, Badiou writes, is not of poetry, but of the poetry philosophy has handed itself over to. Celan's drama is to have had to confront sense in the nonsense of the epoch, its disorientation with nothing but the solitary resource of the poem. When in Anabasis he evokes the ascent upward and back toward the tent word, together. It is to the outer poem he aspires, to the sharing of thinking less plunged into metaphoric uniqueness. The imperative poetry bequeaths to us, the event whose name it enjoins us to find elsewhere, is the poetic call to the reconstitution of a testament of the conceptual disposition of our time. It is the formulation in the poem of the end of the age of poets, which we too often forget brought glory but also torment and solitude to its poets. A solitude compounded and not diminished by the philosophy sutured within it. So Celan is indirectly working against the idea or the notion of the end, of the age of the poets and attempting to bring it by the end. And how is he doing this in his poetry? It is by disobjectifying radically and evermore any referentiality, any sense brought to the word, any connection to even something as valuable to philosophy as truth as it forms into a subject. The only aspect that Celan's poetry refuses to concede on is to lead on inconsistencies, to maintain inconsistencies as active and productive within the poetic space of his writing. Now, why such drama? Well, of course, Paul Celan was Jewish, and he lost much of his family to the extermination camps in Romania. And Heidegger, of course, was a Nazi, and Celan had to beat him. So Badiou writes, everything hinges, it is quite true, on the sense we give to the encounter between Celan and Heidegger, a quasi-mythical episode of our epoch. Lacour-Labarthe's argument is that the Jewish poet survivor could not tolerate, support, in any case, overlook the fact that the poet's philosopher kept in Celan's presence and in every presence the most complete silence about the extermination. I do not for a second doubt this to be the case, says Badiou. But there is also the fact, and necessarily so, that to go see the philosopher was to experience what the ascent upward and back toward the sense of the epoch could expect from him in the element of the outer poem. Yet this philosopher referred to the poem precisely in such a way as to make the poet feel more alone in his presence than ever before. It has to be seen that Heidegger's question, what are poets for, can become for the poet, what are philosophers for? And if the answer to this question is for there to be poets, the solution of the poet is redoubled. Celan's work makes an event of this solitude by asking from the position of the poet that an end be put to it. The event is that in hopelessness and anxiety, Celan the poet detects within poetry the passing of this restitution. The event becomes the notion to think, and certainly, despite Badiou's own words at this point, at how the three notions of subject, being, and truth are central and constant in philosophy's development, it is fundamental to understand for greater comprehension of Badiou's philosophy, of course, that giving and indeed confirming the centrality of event as producing novel and radically irreducible forms of subject requires for philosophy to overhaul all of its categories. The radicality or the radicalness of Badiou's philosophy is structured around the event itself. The event, of course, does not affect philosophy per se, but philosophy extracts, due to the event occurring in the conditions, a profoundly novel and more refined notion of ontology, of being, and overthrows Heidegger's conviction that subject came to partake of the advance of the essence of technology over being qua being, being as irreducible, being as an event. Being is not an event in Badiou's philosophy. However, it is triggered by the event. My name is Norman Mataras. Been listening to Philosophizing with Badiou, a reading for the fresh. Next time, we'll try to, well, we shall move towards the end of this first phase of discussing Badiou's philosophical system. Whether we finish or not will depend on what has to be done. Until then, make sure to read Manifesto for Philosophy. If you're able to read the first few chapters of Conditions, I believe it has been translated into English. Recall that we're in the space and period of Badiou's production that I delimit roughly to the mid 80s until, uh, let's say, a transitional period evoked by the book that I also translated, that I decided to call Briefings on Existence, short treatise on transitional ontology. So this transitional ontological period is where Badiou's establishing the distinctions between the phenomenologic and the ontology. But it's important when we read Badiou's work to know what is the period in reference to which we're actually, in reference to which part of, which pillar of the system we're actually working on. So right now, and for the foreseeable future lectures, we shall be maintaining our focus on the ontology, testing this ontology against the conditions, and we will shortly reach also a defining moment of testing it against the claim that ontology is not intrinsic to philosophy. In fact, ontology is external to philosophy. And this is the only way that philosophy, in fact, can provide a non-circular valorization of what ontology is. And ontology, in that regard, is mathematics insofar as mathematics engaged in speaking and saying what it is, meaning the theory of the foundations of mathematics as presented through the Cantorian, Dedekindian, Fregean, and Gödelian venture of set theory. I'm Norman Mataras. Hope to see you next time.